Hello everyone, today I would like to show you how I paint light rays. There are many different ways to do this, but the one I'm showing in this video are my favorite. Let's get started. The first method is to lift up some paint. I'll be using the wet on wet technique for this method. You don't have to use wet on wet, it's just that for me personally, I find wet on wet is a lot faster. So after I wet the paper with clean water, I'm gonna use a white color and cover the page with this mixture. This step is somewhat optional. I find that by doing this, I can keep the paper wet a little bit longer, and also when I lift off the paint, the surface of the paper is less likely to deteriorate. After that, I'm going to mix some color and just put that down on the paper. I'm using blue mixed with a little bit of white here, but it doesn't really matter. You can kind of use any color that you want. It doesn't have to be blue. You also don't have to use just one color. You can use like multiple different colors mixed together and just kind of drop it down on the surface of the paper. Because the paper is still wet, the paint's gonna blend in nicely with each other without leaving any hard edges. After that, we want to leave the paint to dry just a little bit. Then I'm gonna go back in with a clean and slightly damp brush and start lifting off some of the paint here. After a couple strokes, I will clean my brush again and dab it dry slightly on a paper towel. We can also use a tissue and dab it in the area where we want the paint to be lifted off. Beside the big stroke, I'm also going to lift off some of the paint in a smaller, more like a skinnier line stroke like this. Every time we create a stroke with our brush, some of the paint that we lift up will get stuck on the brush, so we want to clean our brush pretty regularly. And also, dab it dry slightly so the brush would just be a little bit damp instead of completely wet. Here, I'm just repeating the same process with slightly different size stroke to make it more interesting so that, all the light rays don't look the same. I'm also going back in around the edges of this stroke and lifting up more paint, making the light rays look a little bit more straight, making the edges around that rectangular shape a little bit more sharp. This is more of a personal choice. If you want your light rays to be a little bit softer and doesn't have very straight edges, then you don't have to do this step. Afterward, I'm going to add a little bit of white back in the middle of these light rays. It may look pretty bright right now, but if your paint is still relatively wet, when everything dried up, it's going to look a lot darker than what it is right now. So I usually like to add just a couple white mixture kind of in the middle to make sure that when the paint dries, those areas will still look pretty light. And finally, I like to go back in with a dry, soft, fluffy brush and very gently go over our painting like this in the same direction as the light rays. This helps blend everything together and create a softer look. And this is our first method. Before we're moving on to the next method, I would like to note that we can make our light rays look slightly different by varying the paint consistency. So here, after wetting the paper with clean water, I'm mixing some red paint mixture. But I'm going to add a lot of water to this mixture, making it super thin. Just like previously, I'm gonna cover the paper with this mixture. And immediately you can see that this background is a lot more transparent compared to last time because of the amount of water that I added to my paint mixture. Now, if we lift off the paint just like we did previously with a clean damp brush, we will see that it takes less stroke for us to create that white area because our background is relatively transparent and thin, so there's not a lot of paint for us to lift off. Besides that, the light area also have much softer edges compared to previously. It looks almost like it blends in with the background. Because of that, I don't need to add more white after I lift off the paint or going over the area with a dry, fluffy brush. For comparison, I'm going to go over the same method again, but this time I'm going to make sure that my paint mixture is slightly thicker. When we add this mixture to the background, it will look more opaque compared to the one on the left hand side. Now, using the same method, a clean damp brush to lift off the paint, you will see that we need a lot more stroke to get all that paint off. And also there are a bit more contrast, a little bit more of a hard edge from the white area to the background compared to a very soft look on the left hand side. One advantage of using the thicker paint for the background is that we can create different opacity for our light rays. So if we want a bright white light rays, we can lift pretty much all the paint off. But if we want just kind of like a semi-opaque, semi-transparent light rays, we can do that by not lifting all the paint up and just, leave some there. As you can see here, the top light rays is a lot brighter compared to the bottom one, because on the bottom one, I left some of the paint still on the paper to create that kind of semi-transparent look. Now moving on to the second method, I will still be using wet on wet technique. So first I'm using a clean brush to spread out water on the surface of my paper. And I'm gonna mix a color that I want my light rays to be. So in this case, I want it to be a very bright yellow color. So I'm adding diagonal shape with that mixture on the paper. Then I'm adding some more yellow to my mixture to make the outside edge of the light rays just a bit darker compared to the middle part. After that, I'm mixing the color for my background, and in this case it will be a green color. So I'm adding a little bit of blue to make still almost like a very yellowish green, and blend that in, keeping my stroke diagonal, just the same direction as the light rays, and kind of add this mixture in between the light rays. We want to slowly transition from dark to light. We don't want to add like a very dark mixture immediately. So I'm going to add that light green first, and now I'm adding a little bit more blue to mix a slightly darker green for the outer edge and for some of the darker area, kind of in between the light rays. And the advantage of doing this wet on wet is that the water will help blend everything in for us without creating any hard edges. And just like the first method, I'm also going back in with a dry, soft, and fluffy brush to blend everything in. Make sure that we move our brush in the same direction as the light rays, and also don't put a lot of pressure on this, just gently, almost like caressing the surface of the paper. And this was what we got at the end. Besides the two wet on wet method we just did, I would like to talk briefly on how to paint light rays using dry on dry and wet on dry. So here I added some pink colors to the background, and before we go in and do anything, I make sure that my paint has completely dry off. So another way to create light rays is to create a dry on dry texture effect. So here I have a relatively dry brush with no water in that white paint mixture. Then I'm gonna paint in the light rays by gently brush against the surface of the paper in the diagonal manners, just like what we've been doing previously, but this time we want to put less pressure on our stroke with very dry paint to create this kind of broken up texture on the paper. This method will not give you the soft edge blend-in look like what we had previously, but it's not like worse or better, it's just a completely different look that will suit certain painting and style better than the other ones. And if we want any section of that light rays to be a little bit brighter or less broken up, then we can just add more white paint to that area. So that is our dry on dry method. Now let's move on to the wet on dry. For this one, I want to add a little bit water onto my white paint so that it's not completely dry like the last one. Then I want to dab it on my towel just a little bit, so you want your mixture to be thin, but you don't want your brush to be too wet. And I'm painting in the light rays using the same diagonal stroke that we've been doing. Just like the dry on dry method, we want to be relatively gentle and not put a lot of pressure on our brush. If we do, we may reactivate the background colors. And it's not a big deal in this case, but imagine if you have like a full background paintings with some trees, some nature. That's why I added those kind of like vertical stroke there to indicate that like if we had some trees underneath. We do not want our trees or whatever we added previously to become disfigured. So that's why we want to keep our stroke light without a lot of pressure to make sure we don't reactivate the previous layers. Here I just repeat the process and add one more light ray underneath. Now, if we want the light ray to be a little bit more transparent, we can go in with a clean damp brush and use this to kind of blend in the area that we just added the white paint. Again, be very gentle with this. Any pressure and you will lift off the paint right off, just like the first method. But if we be careful and going over the area gently, we can blend in that white color with the background and create kind of like a semi-transparent look instead of the opaque white mixture that is on the paper right now. When we do the blending, we might lift off some of that white paint, so we're just gonna clean our brush once in a while when we do this. And as you can see right now, the light ray that I'm going back in and blending it in more will become a little bit more transparent compared to the bottom one where it's still relatively opaque. And that's how we do it wet on dry. Now I'm gonna create two full paintings using the first two wet on wet method that we discussed. Again, it's not better or worse than the wet on dry or the dry on dry method. It's just that for the painting that I'm doing, I like to have that soft blend for my light rays, and therefore I choose the wet on wet method instead of the other two. The first painting here will be an underwater scenery where I lift off the paint to create the light rays. This method works great if you want your light ray to be white or whatever the color of your paper is. Whereas the second method, where we blend everything in wet on wet, works better if you want your light ray to have a little bit more color. I will also be using yellow and green for the light ray and the background for my second painting, just to keep it consistent with the demonstration. But you can use pretty much any colors that you want. You know, if you were painting a sunset or anything like that, it could be pink or orange. It doesn't always have to be that yellow and green. Other than that, I'm gonna put on some music. I hope you enjoyed the two paintings that we're gonna do. If you find the video helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment. It's really helped me out with the algorithm. And if you try out any of these methods, let me know how it goes and what's your favorite one.